Today I won't even call it a lecture. I prefer to say it's a study because we are all learning together. That's the truth. So this is the theme that we are bringing today, the moral transformation and healing according to Spiritism. So we are going to reflect what is the relationship between moral transformation or our spiritual change and healing. And so this healing, it encompasses both spiritual healing and healing of body diseases as well. So all healing that we need in our lives. And the moral transformation is basically the path that guides us to spiritual perfection or to God. So what does Spiritism has to tell us about this? How our moral transformation or spiritual transformation guides us to a healing process. And ultimately, how does our healing process is related to happiness in our lives? Because we all are looking for happiness. So I always like to start thinking about Jesus, since Jesus is our master. So what does Jesus teach us about suffering? So usually after healing or helping someone who was sick or who was in need, Jesus used it to say, "Go and sin no more." So in this passage of the Bible, after he helped the woman that became to be known as the sinner woman, he told her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." So with just this small sentence, we can learn some important messages about suffering. The first one is Jesus is teaching us how we should deal with our mistakes. So with our own mistakes and with the mistakes of others. We have one special word here. It's called forgiveness. So Jesus, he applied the forgiveness to that woman because he said, "I don't condemn you." So he forgave her. And then he gave her an important recommendation, the moral change. When he said, "Go and sin no more," he was recommending her to avoid repeating her past mistakes. Not only because something is bad or good, because it's right or wrong, but especially because he wanted her to avoid suffering. He wanted her to achieve happiness, spiritual happiness. And the only way that she could do that, and all of us as well, is to do our moral change. So we need to change something or many things in ourselves for that. And what is sin according to Spiritism? Because we usually hear that word a lot in the Bible. And it has a slightly different concept, I would say, to Spiritists. when we compare like to what other religions would think about sometimes about sins. So basically, it's really simple. The sin is the deviation of the target, of the main target, which is God and his laws. So to sin means that we are taking the wrong path. And then that's it, basically. And there are consequences for us. Usually we see that with a lot of guilt, but it's mostly related to our suffering, basically. So to sin is just to take the wrong path. So we are deviating ourselves to the right path that will guide us to happiness. And I want here to really emphasize this part, how Jesus teaches us to deal with our mistakes. It's something that all of us human beings, we really have to learn and develop skills about that. So usually when we deal with our own mistakes, we have the tendency to feel guilty. Or on the other hand, when we deal with the mistakes of other people, we have the tendency to hate them. So this is like what we are used to doing. But Jesus is giving us a lesson here that we need to practice forgiveness. So first of all, when we forgive ourselves, then we dissolve the guilt. And when we forgive other people, then we get rid of the hate. So we can think, for example, or learn that we don't have to be perfect right now. We are all imperfect. We are learning, right? So when dealing with our memories or our past mistakes of this life or other lives, we can say out loud to ourselves, I don't need to be perfect right now. I wasn't perfect at that moment. Yes, maybe I made bad decisions, or maybe I was just ignorant. Maybe I didn't know at that time a better way to behave or to feel or whatever, because I'm learning too in this spiritual path to God. So I don't need to be perfect. But yes, I want new experiences in my life. So I pray for that. I deserve that. Okay, so this is like a different inner monologue that we should try to develop to ourselves, because usually our monologue is different, it's negative. So we give negative feedbacks to ourselves. So we can try a different way according to what Jesus teaches us and practice, really practice this forgiveness. And the other way is concerning other people. Sometimes it's more difficult to forgive others, or sometimes it's more difficult to forgive ourselves. But when dealing with other people, we can tell ourselves they're learning as well. So they're also learning, they're also ignorant. Okay, so, and who has never been wrong? I know it's hard. Sometimes we all have stories. Everybody has been hurt somehow, or we also hurt other people. So I know it's not easy as it may sound when we talk about our feelings. They take long to change. But if we continue to ask ourselves and to think about it and to pray about it, the spirits and God, they will inspire us and help us to see in a different way. So if we ask ourselves, who has never been wrong? I made mistakes. If I admit, I also make mistakes. I make mistakes every day. So as a consequence, other people make mistakes too. So this helps us to smoothen a bit the process. And another thing that is really important here is the moral change. So after practicing forgiving myself and forgiving other people, I need to recognize as well that I want to change. So I don't want to be the same person or the old man, the old woman that I used to be. And here it requires three things: our will or our desire to change, to move on, the self-knowledge, and perseverance. So these things combined will lead us to our moral change. And we have to acknowledge that it's a long process. So sometimes it's not fast acquiring virtues and overcoming our vices. So this is why we need patience with ourselves and perseverance. The self-knowledge is because if I don't know myself, I don't know what I need to change. So this is a process where I go deep inside myself and I acknowledge my vices and my virtues. And then I can work better on my own personality. So how did Jesus see the people that are called sinners or people that are just deviating from the target, which is the humanity? I mean, all of us. So Emmanuel, in a message from Chico Xavier, in the Daily Bread, chapter 122, he said that Jesus, turning lovingly to the sinner, he knew above all that he was faced with an unhappy, sick person from whom the characteristics of eternity could not be deprived of. And in another passage of the Bible, in Mark, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So if we pay attention here, Jesus is treating the people called as sinners simply as sick people or sick souls, because he knew that when we commit a sin or when we deviate from the divine law, that means that our souls are sick. And that's it, basically. So this is why he has a lot of compassion towards us, because he knows basically that not loving is a temporary spiritual disease. And I want to make a joke here. So I could stop and finish the whole lecture in this part with the Spirit's book at the question 614, because I think it's a good summary of everything that we should study about happiness, and suffering. So in this question, the good spirits, they told Allan Kardec that the natural law is the law of God. It is the only law that is truly necessary for human beings to be happy. It shows them what they should or should not do, and they only suffer misfortune when they depart from it. So basically, it's really important because all of us, we are looking for happiness in our lives. Every human being, if you ask a person, what do you want the most in your life? And the person will answer, I want to be happy. So, and the concept of happiness, it might change a lot, right? So each and every person will think that you will find happiness in a certain place or in a certain situation. But basically, what the spirits are telling us is that happiness is to live according to God's law. And that's it, basically. So when I read this, I was like, I have always to remind myself, because it might sound so simple sometimes. We know it's deep, but this is the target that we need to follow in our lives. If we want peace, inner peace, if we want happiness, we need to find a way to improve ourselves so that we can live according to the natural law or the law of God. So basically, this means that once we learn how to live, and that means to think, to feel, and to act according to the divine law, we will be happy. And if something in my life, or if many things in my life, they seem to not be working well, then somehow I deviated from the divine law. And what should I do about it? What are the remedies that I can take? Should I just, know about it and that's it? So what should I do? The first one that the spirits recommend us is to know thyself. Because as I mentioned before, once I know myself, I can discover my vices. If I am not aware of them, then I can't change. So this is a painful process. It's not as easy as it may sound, because we have a lot of emotional defenses. So our ego, it doesn't want to know our weaknesses, right? Our imperfections. So we tend to try to hide them from ourselves. But once we do this process, then we can figure out what we need to improve and how to improve. The second thing here is to accept our temporary situation. This is also hard. I recognize it because we don't want to suffer, basically. So we are always trying to avoid suffering. But once we accept our temporary situation, then the things, they start to be a bit more easy to handle. And there's no other way out, because our suffering is basically the consequences of our past choices. So we'll have to face them. We'll have to deal for a certain time with our own choices. And then another remedy is to work to change. This is really important because we have to accept our current situation, but at the same time, we need to work so that we can change and move on to a better situation in the near future, hopefully. And this reminds me of Paul, the apostle, because Paul is a good example of moral transformation. So he spent 3 years in the desert after he saw Jesus. And I can't imagine how hard it was for Paul as a human being, as a man, to face his own mistakes. And so he decided to be by himself, doing this inner process of thinking and analyzing what he needed to change and how he could fix his own mistakes. And it took him 3 years in the desert to do that process. And this story is told by the Spirit Emmanuel in this book that is my favorite book, Paul and Stephen. I didn't know that it was translated to English, but so if you have a chance to read this book, if you didn't so far, I would recommend, because we really need those examples of people that made this process and could transform themselves in one life, I would say. So Paul gives us a good example of a person that had the strength to accept himself as he was and then move on and make what was required to. And I found this on the internet, and I think it's a really good sentence for us to think about. So Buddha said, there is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path. So this is really important to our reflections here, because basically the path, as we understand here, according to Spiritism, is the divine law. So if one is living on the path, which means if one is living according to the divine laws, he or she is living in happiness. So we are usually trying to find happiness, but we will end up finding happiness once we live according to God's laws. I asked him to close the window because, yeah, we are here. It's really cold today here in Michigan. So, yeah, I really want to emphasize this part. So as a summary, the take-home message is that the requisites for happiness is to live within the divine laws. So close the window, please. Is to live within the divine laws. And suffering, it basically shows us, it tells us that we've been in the wrong path. Now we need to take a new path according to God's laws. So suffering is showing us, is telling us something about ourselves. It's not an easy message, but it's a necessary message for our lives. And that also reminds me of the parable of the prodigal son. When God gave, the father, gave the heritage to his young son. So he asked the father if he could have his money right away. And then the father gave him the money, but he spent everything. And this son, he finds himself in a difficult situation, suffering a lot. But in the end, he recognizes that he was in the wrong path and he wants to return to his father's house. So, what does that mean? That means that our heritage is everything that God gives us, everything, our lives, our intelligence, our family. For some people, is the power they have, the richness, and our suffering is the result of departing from the Father or the divine laws. And I think it's always important to remind ourselves about this other passage when we think about the divine laws and living according the divine laws. Because the spirits, they tell Kardec that yes, he could divide these laws in different categories, but basically, if we go back to the Bible, we'll see that Jesus, he was able to summarize the divine law and everything basically back to love. So when he was asked, which is the great commandment in the law, then Jesus answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So as we can see, when we think about living according to the divine law, we are talking about loving God, loving ourselves, and loving our neighbors. And then, so, okay, we recognize that we are looking for happiness. And the spirits say that everyone will achieve that because this is God's will and this is his law. So hopefully all of us, we will end up finding this path to God again and finding happiness. But at this moment that we are right now, we acknowledge that we need somehow to take this other path, like the prodigal son, right? So we acknowledge that we took paths that were not good for us. Now we suffer, but we want to take a new path. And how do we do that? And this is where we come to the concept of the inner reform. So there is this famous sentence, it's in the Gospel according to Spiritism, and where Kardec, I think it's Kardec, not the spirits, but I will have to check. But it is said that the true Spiritists can be recognized by their moral transformation and by the efforts they employ in order to dominate their bad instincts. So here we can conclude that Spiritists are not perfect. Sometimes it may look like, especially when you just come to Spiritism, but honestly, people are just doing their best. They are just making their best to improve. So no human being in this earth is perfect. And spiritists make efforts during their whole lives to create new habits and overcome vices. And this results in our moral transformation. So I know sometimes this process is slow, but there is that sentence in Portuguese. I don't know if I could translate to English like that, but slow and always, right?
Love the little turtle, Clarissa.
Huh?
I love the little turtle.
Yeah, that's us trying to improve.
Right?
So yeah, we're like one step at a time, slowly. Sometimes we get stuck, but we move on. We continue, and then one day we will win, right? We'll finish the race, because changing habits, it's not a quick process. We really need to practice hard and continue to do that every day of our lives. So this is us again, spiritists. Um, we are trying to keep this balance, because we have a blessing in our lives. We have the blessing of information, which is spiritism and the gospel in our lives. But at the same time that we are learning, we are studying, but we are harvesting the tares. They are the consequences of our imperfection. So from the past, or from this life, we have this harvest, and these are our difficulties that we have to handle. But at the same time, we are starting to sow the wheat. So this is our decision to change and be happy. So this is mostly, I would say, 99% of spiritists would be represented by that situation. So we are harvesting consequences, bad consequences of our past, but at the same time, we have decided we want to change, and we are now doing good things, our inner reform, to have a better life in the future. And yes, the moral transformation is not only done with knowledge. This is a very important concept. The first step here for us is to study, learn. So this is the learning step, right? So we study the gospel, we study the spiritism, and this is for us to learn. But our moral transformation in the end, it will be the result of our renounce, of our obedience to God's laws, the identification of one's inferiorities, and the permanent effort to overcome them. So it's a hard work. And yes, we all feel from experience how difficult it is to internally transform, to combat our passions and vices. So that small inner voice, that tiny, boring voice, is always trying to convince us again to repeat our mistakes, okay? So yeah, we have to fight it. It's not easy. It's like educating a child. But it's not easy for everyone. So I like Paul a lot. And one of his famous sentences, he tells us about his struggles with that. So he said, "For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing." So this is us totally, right? And in the end of the day, many times we are like, okay, I failed again. I did that again. But there is hope, because if Paul, the disciple, if he did that but he was able to overcome it after more than 30 years of a hard task, then there is hope for all of us, right? So we will change. We will change. We have to believe we'll make it. And concerning that, I like this story from Chico Xavier. You probably know it. It's really famous. So when Chico was starting his task of mediumship, in the beginning, Emmanuel told him that he was expected to have at least 30 books to start, okay? In the end, he ended up with more than 400 books. But Chico was a very humble person, and he was afraid that he couldn't make it. So he was even afraid that the good spirits could abandon him, because maybe he wouldn't be good enough for that. So he asked Emmanuel for some advice. What should I do so that I can complete my task? And then Emmanuel told him, I will give you 3 advices. The first one is discipline. The second one is discipline. And the third one is discipline. So discipline is really important in the meaning, with this meaning that we should persevere. So we have to continue our efforts to improve, right? So in order to develop good and new habits, we need discipline, to discipline ourselves. This is for everything in life. Whenever we have a particular aim or objective in our professional life, for example, or for our personal life, we need discipline, because we have the desire to achieve that aim, but we have to practice a lot until we achieve it. So spiritual change and moral transformation only happen with constant re-education of the spirit. Forgiveness, charity, faith, hope, patience, and many other virtues come from love. And another sentence from Paul: do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. This is really interesting, because everything starts in our own minds, right? So if we want to change, we have to change our feelings, our thoughts. This is the inner transformation. So I just want to finish with this story about Feliciano Azevedo. And this is a psychography of Chico Xavier by the spirit Humberto de Campos, also known as Irmão X. So this story is about the difficulties, the trials that the Azevedo family was facing. So basically, they had this really serious obsession, spiritual obsession case in their family. So his young daughter, he was dealing with a really and hard spiritual obsession, and she ended up in the hospice for a while because it was really, really serious. And his wife, she went to the hospital because she was really stressed and with that situation. So, but Feliciano Azevedo, he met Spiritism, and then the family had some relief of these trials because the Spiritists, they started to help the family with this case, and the spirit, it was he was an old enemy of the family, so he was looking for revenge. But after a couple months, this young girl, she was treated, and this spirit, he decided to forgive. Um, and then she became better. But after a while, the family started suffering again. So they started facing other difficulties. And then the material scarcity appeared. And Feliciano Azevedo, he even got really sick because it was a really hard situation for the family and for a couple years. So one day, the Spiritists, they were visiting Feliciano, and one of them, he had mediumship. So they had this kind of session, spiritual session. And then Feliciano, he started to talk to one of the spiritual mentors because he wanted some advice for his situation. So then he said, "Thank you for your comforting words, but I can't avoid doubts. Wasn't my family suffering a simple case of obsession? However, I really have the impression that our torments are aggravated heavily. My wife left the hospital to be admitted to the most misery, and my daughter returned from the asylum to become a hopeless beggar." Then he asked how to reach an acceptable conclusion. "Are we not cured of obsession, my friend?" So he asked the mentor about it. And then the spiritual mentor said, "Feliciano, it's true that you've suffered a lot, but don't forget that incarnated friends and discarnates offered you scaffolding. The difficulties and sufferings they provided you stones. Faith carried divine cement to your heart. However, the building is yours. Never complain before the justice of God, because if you are cured of obsession, you still haven't paid off your own debts." So this story is told in the book Reportagens de Além Túmulo. It's in chapter 12, The Complex Cure. So this is like a good summary of our lives. So we face many difficulties and trials once in a while, but after we overcome them, then other difficulties appear because we are in this process of healing, of moral transformation, of inner reform. So we still have to pay off our debt with the divine law. But this is our hope that once we start to improve ourselves and become better human beings, things will get easier and everything will be solved. So that was it that I had to discuss with you. Thank you very much, everyone.